Welcome to Conscious I, living in authentic connection and harmony with self, others, and the world, featuring Ravi and Savitri.
Because here we are talking about neurodivergence today. And I think how many artists, how many musicians, how many folks, especially from different generations, I think maybe went, of course, well, we have to label everything now, so we would say undiagnosed. But, how many folks have been living with neurodivergence or in a neurodivergent state for so long. And so that's interesting that we're talking about this today, And something I recognize in myself and, some neurodivergence, perhaps. And disclaimer, not that any of this coming out today is going to be in any way, shape, or form recognized as any sort of authority for, therapeutic, related to counseling or therapy. This is just a discussion on neurodivergence, and perhaps how I looked at it was the intersectionality of neurodivergence and spirituality.
Yeah, I think that, the whole concept of testing people and figuring out what their learning styles are and some of the other things started really not so long ago. One of the first sources of looking at personalities and how people operate socially was the Myers-Briggs. And that came out right after World War II, like in 43 to 45. And then finally it was standardized in the early 60s. But then from there, people started exploring, well, I wonder why, especially in the world of education, I wonder why these students aren't learning certain ways. And so in the early 80s, here we go with Howard Gardner and his learning style theory, and he came up with 8 different intelligences. And then it's just ballooned since then. I know when I first started teaching, we may talk about a student here or there, teachers. There were teachers as well. We all had different attributes that now, today, could quite possibly be what the word is that you said, diagnosed. And so I will hopefully be not talked about too much, because really it's about looking at the strengths, the qualities that people bring to their lives. And there's so many things about what we're learning and what we've learned since those 2 examples I just gave, what we're learning now about how people learn, how people relate to each other, what's going on inside. And the communication system is opening up and we're cracking some codes. And when that happens, we're able to bring the best out of everybody. People emerge, they bloom, they blossom, and they contribute in a really significant way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think you hit on something that came up in my prep for today's conversation, and I'm going to reference a lot a really great paper, which I recommend. Maybe we can link it, but it was by Amira Arora. I hope I'm, correct me if I'm mispronouncing that, anyone out there, but it was from August of 2025. Spirituality, Neurodiversity, and Mental Health, Understanding Unique Spiritual Expression Among Neurodivergent Populations. So anyway, that's my show note. And that said, what you hit upon was a lot of the approach to some of these labels, diagnoses now, we have so many, is often coming from a perspective of deficit. It's deficit oriented. And this, what I appreciated about this particular paper, and there's a lot of what I'll reference, is it really is coming from a place of, how do we challenge that deficit approach, to neurodivergence, and how folks with, whether it's ADHD or, on the autism spectrum or Tourette syndrome, are some examples of the types of conditions, or, that we are kind of talking about here. How appreciate about this paper, especially, which I'll be referencing quite a bit, by Arora, is her or their focus on the removing the deficit perspective and looking at it at the unique strengths that folks with neurodivergence hold, things like heightened pattern recognition, creativity, visual thinking, and deep focus. So what you mentioned there just really struck a nerve, because there is a shift from, this is a problem to be solved,
right?
Which I think that's been, and still is. You'll see an argument out there for how horrific it is for folks to live, because this is also, things like the autism spectrum is vast, and the variance is great, right? Mm-hmm. So you can, the level of folks living with autism, that they can participate in society, or, the severity of, their condition varies greatly. And so I know there's an argument out there, people, nobody should be forced to live in this state, and et cetera, et cetera. However, when we look at the strengths that are embedded into these folks, living with what is neurodivergence, right? Not in the normative, what we consider to be
the perspective.
Normative.
Right. It's a judgmental
function.
perspective
Mm-hmm.
coming from what people would consider to be normative ways of thinking, behaving, and interacting. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And when we flip that approach, as is typical, we get some really rich insight into not just, their lives, but in all of our, it's the intersectionality of all of our lives. So
yeah.
It's something that stood out to me right away, what you said.
Yeah. And, from the inside out, with some of the way that, especially the spectrum, the autism spectrum, from the inside out, what happens is that not understanding social cues. Now, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone with autism. So we've already talked about how the neurotypical views the neurodivergent, and those two examples are in here. But bottom line is the ability to manage all of the input without having a lot of filters does a couple things. Can cause frustration, where we see someone acting out or having panic attacks visually. That's how it's perceived. Or maybe having behaviors that are considered to be very assertive, even aggressive, because of the frustration index. The other thing that can happen is that there's a shutdown. And so becoming nonverbal or selectively verbal is an option. The thing that's interesting about from the inside out with the autism spectrum is that someone with autism when they're a child, so I'm talking about having worked with children, slowing things down, minimizing distractions, and creating a routine with rhythm provides a sense of trust. And we've had this trust dialogue in so many of our episodes, and this really is the core of it. So when something comes out of routine or something comes out of the environment in a way that is sudden or unanticipated, it triggers what could be considered a panic attack. However, if someone is nonverbal, they're trying to close that down, they're trying to manage it. So it's really important to be able to help people, especially young children, and it's good if we can start them early in the years, how to decode social cues. What's important to pay attention to? What could be a distraction? So getting very nuanced about just being in an environment with others or an environment where they have certain things that they're trying to accomplish gives them an opportunity to learn social cues. So often they may be perceived as a little stilted or maybe a little bit different, but at the same time there's a participation that's going on there because now they intellectually understand what a facial expression brings, what a tone of voice will bring, what a certain body language might bring. And so they're able to go through a lot of those learnings, and that goes a long way for someone with autism, especially if there's social anxiety that's attached to that.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot, and I'm, I don't want to diminish the challenges that come with, any, of course, being anywhere on the spectrum or with any, neurodivergent tendencies, whether, you're talking about ADHD or Tourette's or, being on the autism spectrum. And, things may be a little more than just a little bit like, oh, that's a little bit stilted. I think, the words that you use. Sometimes, I have friends who have experienced the anxiety of going out in public places with their kids, because of the judgment, when their children are responding to stimuli. And I want to kind of reiterate something that you mentioned is the consistent and gentle, connection and instruction on things like social cues, things that we take for granted.
Sure.
Because, and again, in my experience, when I interact with my friends' kids, the level of intelligence and brightness that especially comes through and is emerging in their artwork, what they observe and how they express that in their artwork and in their play and in their communication is so profound. So I think what, is so important and something that was also really outlined and emphasized in Aurora's work in this August 2025 journal or paper is how the intersectionality of neurodivergence and spirituality also is reliant on being open to the perspective of, alternative paths. So, there's a recognition of the importance of cultural influence and religion on how we process and express spirituality. And yet those in a neurodivergent state may have different expressions that aren't as accepted in those traditional doctrines or practices. So this was something that I really connected with, coming from a very fundamental conservative background in which there was music but no instruments, so only vocal music was expressed. Mm-hmm. It was expressed in 4-part harmony always, without instrument, always a cappella. That was always led by a man. Just so there was so much restriction around music and how that was used in worship, which is completely anti who I am, and how when I really understood the importance of rhythm and dance, and now starting to enter the scene drumming, how that connects me with my own spiritual practice and my own spirituality, that really connected with me, because there's a mention how there may be a deeper connection to those practices that use repetition, things like mantra. Mm-hmm. In fact, a friend of mine from Vietnam, who I was fortunate enough to room with in my Kundalini Yoga teacher training in Bali, she does a lot of work with children mm-hmm. on the spectrum, and children, they do a lot of Kirtan Kriya. Thank you. See, you just need to do it, and which Kirtan Kriya is used to improve memory as well. But that is something like you mentioned earlier. It slows the kids down, and when they're in a more agitated state, it's a tool that they can use to bring themselves back to center, to then respond to the stimulus or stimuli, whatever, in a more quote unquote neurotypical or appropriate way, right? There's a whole conversation we could have around that too. What is normal? What's acceptable? What's appropriate? I honestly am on the side of, hey, flailing arms and responses to loud noises. I understand that. I get that. Let's make room, make space, and let's all quiet down. I'm all for that. Mm-hmm. But we're in a world where we're developing an understanding. So there's a lot of compassion I have to remember to have for others as well in that. But
yeah. Well, the reason that I brought up Howard Gardner's work, even though it's been a while that it's been out, his book Frames of Mind really can almost be a guidepost for what you just said, in that we look at the way people respond. We look at the way people want to express themselves. Maybe they learn best through music. Maybe they learn best through interaction or intra-action with themselves. And there are the other intelligence as well, logical thinking and visual and auditory, that type of thing. So, when you look at how they have been described, you have that overlap. Music is the auditory, right? And visual would be the artistic expression. So depending on who you look at now and who you read, you'll find that there are some things that are parallel to that. And the whole point is to be able to touch each other in a way that each life can feel whole and complete and participatory. And another thing we mentioned in our previous episodes a few times is the belonging. So understanding the internal world, the inside out, with not just people with autism, but you mentioned ADHD and Tourette's, and there are a few others that are on the list too, but those are the ones I think people really know best. But it's interesting you brought up the Kirtan Kriya, because before young children realize or are taught this, often they self-soothe by doing this themselves. They
Right.
already have recognized that that causes that calming sensation in their bodies. And
Just
then,
as sticking out your tongue,
mhm,
lion's
mhm,
breath, that also is a nervous system regulator.
exactly.
So yes, kids, and what do we call that? We call that, oh, you're acting out. Don't stick your tongue out at me. I don't know if kids do that anymore. I think that was a thing when I was young and maybe beyond. I think there's probably cycles of behavior, but sticking out your tongue when you were a kid, you were so mad. It's what you did. You stuck your tongue out. And I remember getting in trouble for that. And you learn later in life, oh, well, that, of course, is something that we do to calm and soothe the nervous system,
Mhm,
regulate. Maybe we even, use it for lion's breath to transmute some anger energy or, process energy. So, like you mentioned, uh, mantra or the mudra of Kirtan Kriya is something that you may see someone doing before they realize what it is.
mhm,
And Kirtan Kriya is just one of the practices that organizes that and formalizes it in a way that can be practiced
mhm.
and learned and then used to self-regulate. So,
And these
yeah.
things are ancient. Let's go back to our episode on long-term back history. These teachings have come through ages, and they were brought forward. I want to circle back to your experience with your music for worship in your religious upbringing. And uh, I grew up, and I was always in choir and piano, and did the music growth thing that a lot of people get an opportunity to do. But my religious experience with music was Gregorian chant. And so uh, I we were reading that music for voice, and then there was the Western version of the treble and bass clef for the keyboards and other instruments. But uh, I remember being so disappointed. In fact, it was probably the cracking point in my connection to the Catholic Church, was when the Gregorian chant was taken out of the services, because it was so calming, and the
Mm.
vowel sounds so pure and the consonants so soft, and you could just spin out the voice for a long, long time. I'm digressing, but uh, when you look at that and then think, okay, where am I today? I'm in mantra. So that's the um, the similar kind of experience, that having had that Gregorian chant early
Yeah.
years experience
Yeah.
similar. Yeah.
No, folks are all, when I share my practice or, talk about it with others, you often hear, oh, I can't meditate, or I can't sit still, or I don't know how to meditate, or I can't make my mind be quiet, or, I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm just like, that's why I practice primarily Kundalini meditation, because there is always something going on. I've set my posture. There's a mudra, probably. There's a drishti or an eye gaze. I will typically choose one that includes a mantra or a music or a breath, rhythm, something, so that my mind always has something to focus on. Oh, check my eye gaze. Is that okay? And yep. And sit a little taller and align. And in doing that, and I'm very familiar with the monkey mind and the ADHD, and it's all over the place, and I cannot, and all of a sudden, if you're in that practice and you do it consistently and you do it long enough, you realize that you hit those moments where the orchestra plays and you're in symphonic harmony with your body and your self-sensory system. And it's like, oh, yeah, okay, this is why I do that. And then you're right back and you're like, oh, okay, now here I am again in my body, boop-a-doop-a-doo, and, it all, you do all that again.
Yeah. And,
I'm very familiar with that.
Yeah. It's interesting you should say that, because the practice that I lead and have practiced for a while is Pradipika Hatha Yoga, which includes all of those things that Kundalini does. And so, again, it has a different lineage, but a lot of parallel track in the way that the mind goes and the breath goes and the mudras and then the asanas. So different structure, different format, but very deeply connected in the outcome.
Yeah, it's whatever works for you, right? And that's why there's this was, again, really highly recommend folks to go out and read this paper. Another thing that was brought up was the importance of subjective meaning making, right? Nothing has meaning until we assign it. And I think when we look at religion, especially cultural aspects of it and how it's impacted or used in culture, it's not very inviting of individual's story. It's basically saying, no, you conform to this belief, this doctrine, this practice, this tradition, this way of thinking, this way of being, this way of expressing, which is so the anti of what we are here to do.
Yoga's
and to
unity.
Be.
Yeah.
Right. And so when we prioritize subjective meaning making and first person narratives and resist, that in itself is resisting the neurotypical framework, right? Interpretive framework, or reductionist, as they mention here, reductionist clinical models that dictate what spirituality should look like, what our spiritual experiences should look like. Because another issue that folks with neurodivergence probably, well, I'm not, for certain run into more than other folks is being dismissed or misdiagnosed or their behaviors or experiences misinterpreted and misunderstood. And it's intense. I have worked with folks that I can think of specifically who have had what I would call a Kundalini awakening. I'm not going to diagnose them with that, but what they're describing is a Kundalini awakening, but having been already ingrained in the mental health structures, the way they're built already, that was interpreted as a psychotic break. It was treated differently than if it were treated as, something that was impacting, had it was a spiritual impact. So again, there can be a greater disparity as to how someone is allowed to express or develop their connection with their spiritual practice and expression, and also how they receive or download information.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, I
This,
think
when we make space for when we make space for just a broader perspective, we make room for there to be different, I think a more welcoming and inclusive space for people to have those spiritual experiences without being misunderstood, misinterpreted, or misrepresented.
yes, I agree with that. And what I'm sensing from um your descriptions is that when, and I'm going to step out of this and be on the edge of a limb, right on the edge, because I've been through programs for training for counseling and psychological testing. So I've got that background, although I'm not a licensed counselor. So sometimes I have to tease my way through this. So I'm going to do that. And what we lose sight of, I think, often is that we see the diagnosis and we miss seeing the person. And when we
Absolutely.
miss seeing the person, it doesn't matter. You can diagnose someone from here until the rest of time, and it won't make any difference. So, setting that aside and just coming to anybody, doesn't matter whether they have this neurodivergent thing hanging on them or this neurotypical thing hanging on them. It separates and it sets up the relationship in a different way. And I can speak to this because I've taught students that would fall into both of those now rather typical categories. And as hard as you try, there is that unintentional microaggression or that unintentional just nuance of difference that may happen because you're trying so hard to relate and to enter that world that maybe the teacher is very different than that world. Maybe that teacher shares some of those same characteristics and attributes. Either way, stepping over the diagnosis and getting to know the person, building the common social things that need to happen first, which is trust. It takes a lot of time, compassion, patience, and like you mentioned earlier, it's not always going to be a breakthrough. It's not always going to be the result that you would hope for in the time that you have. But sometimes it is. And sometimes it goes way beyond even that. So, how do we do that? I don't know. That's something that each person has to come to on their own.
I think a puzzle piece of that, how do we do that? And because something, that's really coming up for me is in the environment. Our environment, the environments we create or have created, let's just say, the structures, really the physical environments that surround us have been favored by, a culture that embraces the hustle and bustle and busyness and activity and a lot of stimulation. So we're lucky enough so far to have places in the world that you can go and find quieter, calmer space, but our environments also play into that, and how our environments have changed, what we surround ourselves with, the devices that we surround ourselves with. And I'm not saying this in any way, shape, or form to be like that's a all negative thing. But how we intentionally use these things or integrate them into our society and culture matter.
Mm-hmm.
And we can do that in a more inclusive way, in a way that makes life more enjoyable and easier for all, or we can do that in a way that is restrictive and also just not healthy for anyone, you know? So that's a choice. That's a choice. We've certainly made some choices that got us to where we currently are. But again, something that is acknowledged throughout this, and something I really appreciated in this writing is how there's a growing understanding and there's a growing interest in exploring more deeply these relationships and the intersectionalities and the importance of spirituality and recognizing that and making space for it in a world that embraces neurodivergence. So I think there's a lot of hope there. And I think that as we're living through an age in which all systems and structures are up for review, you know, and we talk about, oh, this needs to be dismantled and this needs to be, you know, this needs to crumble and this needs to be torn apart. Well, what do we replace it with? And I think, you know, we can start to reimagine through our own personal narratives and rituals combined with the wisdom and the teachings and the trusted practices throughout the ages and eras, we can start to develop more compassionate structures and systems that are more welcoming to all, that allow for greater expression, individual expression, you know, the unique expression of ourselves and the way we express all aspects of our self-sensory system, you know, express ourselves in our physical bodies as well as our, you know, through our emotions and our spirituality. So I think this is part, you know, we've talked about in past episodes, just, you know, we're in the dark ages. Yes. That doesn't mean that, you know, that we have to live there. We can, that's being in the world, but not of it. If you want to use a nice old-fashioned Christian term or phrase, our job here is to live here and be in the dark ages, but to bring the light and to remember who we are and why we're here. And we're all a part of that. So whether we call it neurodivergence or neurotypical or whatever label you want to give it, the bottom line is that we make room for compassion and space for all to be able to express themselves, to give and receive in the ways that nurture and fulfill themselves and therefore then others, and so on and so forth into that never-ending cycle.
Yeah, and labels are so tricky because, you know, as we talk about labels and because the language of our topic tonight really is about looking deeply into what are the attributes and characteristics of the whole person that may fall into a category of being on the autism spectrum or ADHD or Tourette's, or the list goes on. At the same time, you know, the labels right away set up an individual to be different. And so it's such a fine line to tread to, again, like I said, go beyond and meet the person where they are. We hadn't talked about the sensory stimuli and what that might bring. Like perhaps there's clothing that is really uncomfortable for someone because they are sensitive to either the fabric or the cut. Maybe it's too tight, maybe it's too loose. And so just like for parents, getting to know your child, each child's going to have specific things that they appreciate and what they don't. Some like vegetables, some don't. So, and so where do we draw the line and allow them to choose some things that are comfortable for them, which will build trust, even if it doesn't make sense to the adult. If it's do no harm, even better, right? It's something that we can accept and enable and bring into someone's life. If they thrive better on a routine that's rather structured, great. If they don't, then that's a whole nother situation. But the clothing often is a paradox, because if an individual is sensitive to a certain type of fabric or the way the clothing fits, they might also not have a sense of when they're in pain, when they have a fever or feel sick or have a headache. So from that perspective, you think, how does that make sense that someone's so sensitive to the fabrics that are on them, or their beds, or any other thing, that how the chair fits under them, but at the same time can't recognize when they're sick? So there are things that appear to be contradictory, and just getting to know each nuance. And that's part of getting to know a person. If I meet a new person and eventually start having a dialogue, we talk about, well, this is what I prefer in my life, and I might say, well, that's not so much for me, but I like this. So is that a deal breaker? I don't know. But when you're raising children that are on the spectrum to one degree or another, because you did make that point by saying, it's not a one size fits all. It's an exploration and a mystery to solve. But helping any child grow up is a mystery to solve, regardless of what we choose to say.
Or a mystery to embrace. Yeah, absolutely. And I just think this conversation is important to have, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there that there's a growing number of and this isn't healthy for the nation, and hey, final word, final say. We're all unique. We all have a place here. We're all part of the natural world, and it's about the environments we create, the relationships we form, and the experiences that we build together that are going to shape our futures, the collective futures, and really, circle back to the assist in our ego and spiritual evolution. So that's the bottom line. I'm really excited to see that there's a lot more out there on this topic than I thought there was going to be. So I do invite our listeners to go out and check out. I'll link, or we'll link the resource here. But there are so many different links I was able to reference. It was like a little web of definitely some rabbit holes to go down. But that's what we do, right? We learn more. We learn how to evolve ourselves, our ego, and our relationships.
And I love that you brought in evolution, because there is a quality about the generations that are bringing some of this way of being to us in the collective. And the spiritual line runs very deep in a lot of individuals that we just talked about. Yeah.
How we respond, how we react, the spaces we create, the relationships we build, that is about everyone, but it's about us. It says a lot about us, and it says a lot about who we are as a society, as a culture. So this is again, an area I'm excited to see grow. And what we can do is hold that space, create the spaces. So share with us, listeners, how in your community, I'm seeing a lot of stuff pop up, especially in my UU community, spaces for folks to come together, to have play dates, to socialize, to recognize, and I see a lot of folks coming back to things, spiritual practices like drumming. I love to see our drum circles growing. Mm-hmm. Community singing is making a resurgence, something also I'm involved in on the side. So listeners, let us know, how are you making space for spirituality in your lives that may look a little different than what we've been told it should look like, maybe for some time. So be curious to hear that from our listeners.
There's a strong group, also many groups actually throughout the country that are utilizing the visual arts and the
sacred geometry we didn't even talk about, but maybe producing art, sacred drawings. Different, I've got a lot of different examples that are coming to mind now, but absolutely share with us what's coming up for you. And
well, we had some interesting times tonight, and I'm glad we decided to talk about this.
Certainly, again, to all our listeners, let us know what you'd like to hear. If there's something that piqued your interest out of this, shoot us a message, leave us a comment, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we will see you next week. So thank you for being here. Sat Nam.
Thank you. Namaste.